Hello everyone, welcome to Ask Concussion Doc episode number 27. Today we have obviously a fairly large news story coming out of the NHL from their concussion settlement. We got some details on that as well as some insight. And also we have a couple questions, one on noise sensitivity and another one on returning to driving after a concussion, which is an interesting one that a lot of clinicians have. And so see if we can answer those ones for you today. So first off, the NHL Settlement Lawsuit. It is a tentative $18.9 million non-class settlement that was announced on Monday. It was a group of 300 plus former NHL players that alleged that the league failed to better protect them from and educate them about head trauma and concussions. The result, the NHL does not actually acknowledge any liability for the plaintiff's claims. The parties agreed that the settlement is a fair and reasonable resolution. Options for the players: they have time to accept the undisclosed settlement or forego the lump sum payment and pursue individual litigation on their own. The settlement was estimated at $22,000 per player, which I believe to be fairly low, considering what I think the NFL one was quite a bit higher than that one. In addition to the cash payment, settlement includes neurological testing and assessment for players paid for by the league, and up to $75,000 in medical treatment for players who test positive on two or more components of the test, and that's oftentimes kind of the difficulty in some of this stuff is not all players will test positive on some of these tests. And we said that before there was a study that came out of Buffalo where they studied a lot of these players on various cognitive measures and various imaging techniques, and they found that for the majority of them they didn't have any appreciable deficits compared to a group with no history of head trauma. And so it might be a little bit more difficult for people to actually test positive on some of these tests and get access to that amount of money. They also instituted a common good fund for retired players in need, including those who did not participate in the litigation that's worth $2.5 million. So my initial perception on this was that it seemed fairly low considering the salaries that some of these players would be getting while they played, considering the amount of money that the NHL makes as a league. However, I also believe that the NHL is kind of in not as much as in the wrong as probably what they've been made out to be. And one of the things that comes up into this is that the players are alleging that the NHL failed to better protect them from and educate them about trauma. But I think at the time that a lot of these players were playing, there's a lot we didn't know about head trauma. And so, whose responsibility is it at that point? If the information is not known, do we have to disclose it? I mean, even at this point in time, we still don't know everything about these injuries, and we're a long way away from actually understanding it. There's some, idea that these injuries are leading to long-term health complications, but it's still very unclear as to whether or not that's true or to what degree that is true. So I think that, on first look and first glance, it seemed fairly low, but also we have to take into account that I don't believe that the NHL is really in a place of full liability for this, considering the information that was known at the time and considering the information that we still know or don't know about the risks and dangers of head trauma. And I think at least what this has done now, it's hopefully created some resolution for some of the players that have been affected. It provides them with some medical coverage, some mitigation of some of the, probably the expenses and things that they've had to endure as they've gone through this recovery. And so I think it sheds more light onto the injury itself. And I think so all in all, I'm not sure how many people are happy or displeased with what it is, but you guys can kind of cast your own judgment on that. All right, first question is on noise sensitivity. Noise sensitivity seems to be a consistent problem that lingers even when other symptoms are improving. Do we have any suggestions for that? First of all, I would get a hearing test just to make sure that there isn't something else going on. Make sure that the hearing is fine. That's usually my go-to point to try and see, is there hyperacusis, or is this something that may be just more kind of psychologically guided? And I think that's the big issue with a lot of concussion symptoms is that it's so subjective, right? You might be sensitive to noise, however, it may not actually be considered a noise sensitivity. So I would get checked on that just to try and see. In terms of treatment for noise sensitivity, there isn't really much of a protocol that can be followed, but like anything with concussion on the rehab side of things, it's find out, what's bothering you and try to work yourself up to that. The analogy that I always provide is think about this like a marathon, right? If you wanted, like, let's say the marathon of noise sensitivity is going to like a rock concert, right? You're going to go see Metallica rock out, and that's what you want to be able to do. That's your marathon, and you want to be able to handle that. Now, if you're noise sensitive, at least perceiving that you're noise sensitive, you're not going to go and do that tomorrow. But by adding a little bit and exposing yourself to first, let's say, ambient noise, or increasing the volume of the television slightly over time, or slowly exposing yourself more and more to more areas that would have greater noise, and then eventually maybe riding the subway would be getting up there in decibel levels, and doing things that obviously don't put yourself at risk of damage to your ears, but putting yourself in situations where you're increasing the exposure of that. That's typically how concussion rehab goes. And so back to my marathon example, let's say getting back to full work is your marathon. Well, you're going to start with maybe an hour a day. Then you're going to gradually build to 2 hours and 3 hours and 4 hours and 5 hours and 6 hours, and eventually you're back to full work. And it's the same thing. If I'm going to go out and try to run a marathon tomorrow, I'm going to die. I'm not in good enough shape to be able to run a marathon. But if I started tomorrow with a 3K, and then I jumped up to a 5K, and then I gradually built myself up and got myself in enough shape to be able to run a marathon, I could do it, right? I know I could. And that's kind of the issue with any type of symptom that you're currently having. If you feel dizzy, if you have noise sensitivity, if you have light sensitivity, it's gradually exposing yourself to the stimulus to a greater and greater degree until regular noise doesn't bother you anymore. So a lot of people will avoid things. Like I've seen people with noise canceling headphones. Well, people that wear noise canceling headphones probably have a higher likelihood of actually experiencing noise sensitivity in the future, is because you've decreased the amount of noise that you're exposing yourself to, and now regular conversation seems too loud for you. And it's the same thing. They've done studies on this with light sensitivity. People that are light sensitive had a greater likelihood of wearing sunglasses and exposing themselves to darkness early on in their recovery phase. So the old thing we used to do is say, get rid of any exposure to go and sit in a dark room and don't watch any TV and just kind of be on your own and be in this cocoon cave during your recovery. And then people come out and guess what? They're too light sensitive in regular light. Well, because they've been sitting in darkness for 2.5 weeks. And I think the same thing goes for noise sensitivity, is that if you're shutting it down, your noise canceling headphones, you're going to have a harder time getting back into just regular life, and things that wouldn't have made you sensitive in the past are now making you sensitive. There is some evidence, however, on the other end of things when you look at why people have sensitivity to certain sensations, and some studies have found there's a hyperactivation of the thalamus, which is the sensory integration point for a lot of your sensation. And so people with light sensitivity and noise sensitivity tend to have overactivation of these sensory systems in the thalamus, and so there could actually be some sort of central process as a reason for why you are experiencing this noise sensitivity. So basically, to kind of sum it all up full circle, is we don't really know a lot about it. I think the first step would be to rule anything out. So maybe get your hearing checked, maybe check for some other things like acoustic neuromas and things like that may be causing some problems for you. Once that's been ruled out, then I think the progression would be to gradually increase your exposure bit by bit by bit and see if that helps. But then again, we don't really know a lot about it, and so we're back to square one. So try it out. What are the proper steps to returning a patient to driving after concussion? So this is something that a lot of our practitioners ask, and I think this was actually brought up in the practitioner Facebook group for complete concussion management. So all complete concussion management practitioners have access to a group Facebook, and so they're all trained concussion practitioners, and we share cases on there quite a bit. And one of the questions was, I think they had a patient that they were trying to return back to driving, and I'll provide kind of the answer that I provided within that group. And this is similar to a lot of concussion protocols. So return to learn, for example, it's, well, you start off with kind of your, light cognitive activity at home, then you go to a half day of school, then you go to a full day of school with certain restrictions, and then you go to a full day of school with no restrictions. It's the same thing with returning to sport, and so on and so on. So this one for driving, the first step is usually riding as a passenger in a car. How do you feel riding as a passenger in a car? Do you feel that you get dizzy? Do you feel that it causes a headache? Do you feel that it's too much for you? It's overwhelming to you? Well, if that's the case, then I don't think you're ready to start driving yet, if being a passenger is difficult. Once you feel comfortable being a passenger in a car, the first step would be to drive around the neighborhood with a passenger and drive in residential streets so that you're not putting yourself in high-risk situations because the speeds are slow, and you have a passenger with you. So if you start to feel dizzy, disoriented, get a headache, blurred vision, whatever it may be, you can pull off safely and have that person trade places with you, and they can take over from there. Once you feel comfortable driving around the neighborhood with no increase in symptoms, then get into highway driving and driving further distances and for longer periods of time, but keep the passenger with you. So that passenger with you can take over if need be. Once you feel comfortable in that scenario and you're having no more increase in symptoms, lose the passenger, and now you're back to full driving. So that would be the progression, and that is the progression that I typically put my patients on when trying to return them back to their driving after concussion injury. There isn't really much in terms of a protocol on that. That's just my take on the matter, but there aren't any return to driving protocols that have been developed yet, and so I guess stay tuned for future information on that one. That's it for this week. Be sure to ask us questions so that we can keep this show going and keep answering them for you. You can send the questions in to info@CompleteConcussions. You can also you can put them on my Instagram @concussion_doc, or you can send them into @CompleteConcussions. No personal questions from a clinical standpoint. We need clinician-derived questions or very general questions that can be answered for a lot of people. We can't give medical advice over podcast/Instagram. So hope you understand. Anyway, see you guys next week. Cheers.